Hi, welcome to another IELTS video. In this video, we are looking at the speaking exam, and we're going to go over all sections of the exam and talk about phrases that you can use in each section to deliver your responses to the examiner's questions. If you find this video helpful, come join us at IELTSnetwork.com, where you can meet other speaking partners and post MP3s of your own speaking. And visit my blog at IELTSspeakingblog.com. When preparing for IELTS speaking, the first thing you should do is familiarize yourself with what is expected of you in the different parts of the exam. So, as you know, there are three official parts. Part 1, which is made up of scripted questions. Part 2, which is the cue card part that you will respond to as a monologue. And Part 3, which involves unscripted questions that are asked to you by your examiner. It's more of a discussion back and forth. Unofficially, there's a fourth part, which is the initial greeting when you meet your examiner. So the exam truly begins then. This portion is recorded, which is something you should know, and your examiner will be actively listening for any challenges you have when conducting this preliminary part. So for this section, keep your responses to the examiner's question very short and very to the point. You are not expected to elaborate on any of these responses. So examiners all over the world ask the same 4 questions when the IELTS candidate comes into the room. The first question is for your full name. And here you should just state your native name from in your native language. So here we have Edek Zandroznia. Now the second question, the examiner will ask you what you would like to be called. So Edek has an English name. His name is Edward, and he says, "Please call me Edward." Then the third question, the examiner will ask you where you're from, and the proper response to this would be, "I am from Słupsk, Poland." And there's no need to elaborate on that at all. And then the fourth is the examiner will ask you for your identification. Okay, and then so a simple "here you go" or "here it is" would work fine. Okay, so deliver these with confidence, and then you're all ready to get into part 1. So as I was mentioning, part 1 is scripted. All of the questions that you will be asked are written ahead of time. Your response to each of the questions in part 1 is on average 25 seconds, but that's a very loose average because you will have some responses that could be as short as 5 seconds if you're simply stating a fact in response to a question that only needs a single fact, but some responses might be as long as 45 seconds. So typically the shorter responses are responding to questions that are asking for facts, and the longer responses are responses to questions asking for opinions. So if you're asked an open-ended, broad question like, "Could you describe your hometown?" which would be a mixture of fact and opinion, or "What sort of work do you do?" or "Tell me about your family," you should do what you can to summarize your response. You don't want your response to go much further than 40 or 45 seconds, because you should remember that the examiner is going to be asking you 12 different questions in just part 1. So, and they have 5 minutes to do this. Well, roughly 5 minutes. I mean, it's flexible, but the entire exam is 15 minutes long. So this section, the examiner is trying to get everything out of the way within about 5 minutes or so. Okay, so that's all I wanted to mention about that. So now let's look at the section here. Now the first section of part 1 is going to be either about your home or your work. It's never about any other topic. So you can plan ahead and look at some of these sample responses that I'm offering here. So if the examiner were to ask you, where did you grow up? Now, you want to give a full answer. You don't want to be long-winded. You do not want to be too brief. So I grew up in Ślubsk, which is a city in the northwest of Poland towards the Baltic Sea. The street I grew up on ran through a quiet farming suburb of Ślubsk, and therefore my childhood, the home of my childhood, was quite peaceful. Okay, that would be a full response to that first question. Now, I'm going to share some full responses, and then as we move along, I'll share just little phrases that you can apply to your own responses. Where do you live now? I live in an apartment building on the west side of Shanghai in the Xujiahui district. Now, if you were just to answer, I live in an apartment building, that would, that doesn't answer the question really. The examiner's asking specifically, I mean, what section of the city, what city are you in? Where do you live? So this would be considered a full response. Okay, if the question was something like, what sort of city is Ślubsk? Now this is asking you for opinion and perhaps some fact. So there may be a bit of guessing in your response. And when I say guessing, I mean if you were trying to come up with, say, the population. So for example, if someone asked me what's the population of Ottawa, the city I come from, well, I don't actually know the exact figure. I would guess it's say perhaps around 1.5 million people. And I would use language like that to show that I'm not completely certain. So down here in the second example, I use, well, I believe, and then if we're talking about population, the population of Ślubsk must be reaching 80,000 or something like that. Now, a good way to start the response is something like this. Ślubsk is known for, and then, whatever that thing is. I mean, if it is a fishing community, I'm not entirely sure, but is known for its fishing industry, and thus it has a very large harbor. And the harbor is quite large when compared to the overall size of the city. And then you would kind of develop, the response on a little bit more from that. Sharing examples can help as well in these sorts of when you're sharing an opinion sort of questions, because you can help to add a tangible element to your response. For example, if I were to flip it back to my home city of Ottawa, I might share the example that there is a very large tech area, and thus the city of Ottawa has a significant proportion of the technology sector industry within Canada. Okay, some other phrases we could use are, now if you need to buy yourself some time just to kind of collect your thoughts, try something like, well, let me see, I guess Ślubsk is, and then you could proceed from that, or in my opinion, Ślubsk is a very charming city. It's a historical place, and then you could perhaps mention a thing or two about that. And how that has shaped, the culture of Ślubsk today. So this sort of question, I mean, you'd be looking at responding in probably over 30 seconds, because you would have more to say about this, and the examiner knows you have more to say about this, so they're expecting you to elaborate a little bit. Now, if the questions are asking you about work, so for example, the obvious one, where do you work? This is a very simple, straightforward, it's a question that's looking for facts. There is no need to, use a phrase, for example, like, well, let me see. Well, that doesn't make sense, because you don't know where you work. You should be able to answer this within a second. So straightforward. I work at the PTW Insurance. Let's just change this. I work at PTW Insurance Brokers on Jasper Street in the financial district of London. Okay? And this is very straightforward. It's very to the point. It doesn't actually ask you really what do you do, so you don't want to elaborate in that direction. You're just giving the examiner the particular information they're looking for. Now, a typical follow-up question is, what does your job entail? Now, sometimes students get into this embarrassing situation where they start elaborating too much in the first question, and then the examiner has to ask them a question that they've kind of already started to answer. So you want to be sure that you're providing the examiner with exactly the information they're looking for. So here we have, what does your job entail, or perhaps what do you do at PTW? And a response to something like, stating your title. So I am a senior financial consultant, and then elaborating from that and explaining, particularly what you do as a senior financial consultant. Thus, my job involves providing, and then going on from there. So, for example, potential investors with advice regarding where to invest their money. Okay, or we could continue by going on. So I spend most of my day visiting clients, talking with potential investors on the phone, maybe recruiting. You develop it. I mean, you're an expert on your own career, so there should be lots for you to say. Nice academic phrases to use are things like "I'm responsible for," and then you follow that with a noun or a gerund. So I'm responsible for looking after and then whatever part of your department, or I'm responsible for the paperwork that allows our company to do X, Y, and Z. Another nice academic phrase would be "my main duty is," and again you would follow this with a verb. So my main duty is consulting with potential investors. My main duty is following up with our sales team, developing, and then you develop your idea this way. Okay, now we get to something that's a bit more opinion based. Do you like your job? And now we want to sound academic here, so we should try to use words, for example, like rewarding, fulfilling. These are good positive ways to talk about something in life. Yes, my job is very rewarding or very fulfilling. I would say there are two main reasons I enjoy my work. Now, another little tip that I'll share is that often you look like a very logical individual and a person capable of planning a response on the fly when you number your reasons for the response before actually delivering those reasons. So if you say, yes, my job is very fulfilling, I would say there are two main reasons I enjoy my work. Okay, and sometimes you can actually even say there are two main reasons. As you're saying that, you develop the two reasons in your head. And this is a way to impress your examiner. It looks like you're a logical person and that you're capable of these sorts of logical progressions in your speaking. Firstly, it gives me the opportunity to meet with lots of interesting people. Interesting, you could substitute that for dynamic, you could substitute that for creative, you could substitute that for many words. And secondly, it allows me to travel on occasion, which is something I find breaks up the office routine nicely. And then you might, elaborate on from that. Or do you like your job? I do. I work with some impressive people in my department. They keep our workplace stimulating, inspiring, whatever. And I find this has a positive effect on my work. Okay, so using this sort of academic language, developing your ideas, keeping the ideas linked together. And so this sort of response, again, this is an opinion. So your examiner would expect you to elaborate a little bit. So maybe 6 sentences about why you like your job. Organized, to the point, but a very full answer. Okay, so now after that first section of part 1, you will come to this section. So the examiner will ask you 4 scripted questions about another topic, and this section is roughly 1.5 minutes long, maybe a little bit longer, maybe as long as two minutes. So this could really be about anything. So I'm just sharing a few things that you can use. Sometimes it's nice to qualify your verbs with an adverb. So here we have I particularly enjoy, or if the examiner is asking you about maybe what you do on your free time or something like that, you sound more academic when you qualify your response using these descriptive words. Or for example, I would have to say. Now this is a great phrase because you can apply it to so many different things. Even when we were talking about do you like your job? Well, I would have to say that, yeah, there are several things I enjoy about it. It's a nice sort of lead into to whatever you're going to be talking about, and it makes you sound very fluent when you use it. I would have to say the infrastructure is something I would alter. So, for example, again, if your examiner asked you about Śląsk, if we were this individual from Poland, and they said what would be what's something you would like to improve in your hometown, in your home city, this would be the kind of structure we would want to do. I would have to say the education system is something I would be interested in developing. You see, and then perhaps an example we stick in here. So you see, many children are being held back, or many children are experiencing, or something like that. I wrote here a brain drain just to remind me that to share an example from my own city. So, for example, in Ottawa, Ottawa perhaps is experiencing a little bit of brain drain. So educated people are going to other cities or to the United States or somewhere else to work, and that's something that I would have to say is something I would want to change, something I would want to alter about my home city. Buying yourself more time. Always good to have these phrases in mind, and have several of them, because you don't want to keep saying the same thing. Every time I don't want to say to my examiner, let me think about that for a second, because the examiner is going to think I'm talking like a robot. Let me think about that for a second. I suppose the thing that I would want to alter about my home city is XYZ. It's hard to say. I would guess a couple of different phrases we can use to start our speaking and to stimulate more thought. The examiner asks you 4 scripted questions about another topic. So here, this is the 4th topic, and they ask you, asking more questions about it. Not that perhaps it could be something like, well, what do you think would be a challenging job? And you should be looking for modals in their questions, because typically when you're asked a question with a modal, you're going to respond with the same modal. So I imagine being a police officer would be challenging, or would be rewarding, or would be exciting, depending on what the examiner's asking. Or I imagine, now here, yes, I just wanted to note to myself, so it's a noun or a gerund. Yeah, so anyway, it's just, this is the structure here, and you could stick in a noun or a gerund if needed, and then you would elaborate on that, because, and on. Okay, let's talk about part 2. Recently I made a video entirely on part 2, so you might be interested to have a look at that. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. So as you know, in part 2 you're handed a cue card, and the examiner gives you 1 minute to prepare, and you are expected to deliver a 1 to 2 minute monologue based on what your cue card says. Okay, and then roughly this section of the test is 5 minutes, roughly. So when you are preparing, you want to write a few keywords to help you remember what you want to say about the different things on your cue card. I also strongly suggest you get down some vocabulary that fits in with what the subject is. So if it's, for example, a medical related subject, write down a few key pieces of academic medical vocabulary, because sometimes when you get to speaking, it can be easy to forget these words and not use them. And if you have them written there in front of you, you can pull them into your response from time to time. So now, nice ways to start the part 2. If it asks you, for example, what are some problems of whatever. So there are several, and then we might expand this to say something like, there are several reasons why X, Y, and Z are happening. Firstly, this is happening. Secondly, an additional reason is, and we progress our response that way. Sharing examples is a good strategy to follow, because it helps, once again, you put a tangible slant on your response, and this can really help to add some weight to the overall response that you're giving to the examiner. So I feel XYZ plays a good example here. Or, for example, for instance, you can use these phrases too. Okay, now when we want to progress, we would use phrases like, another thing to consider is, or phrases like, that leads me to my next point. So if you want to connect, and these sorts of phrases are great. Your examiner will love them because it makes it look like there is a logical progression to what you're saying. Lots of, they definitely can't mark you down for cohesion. And if you're saying these phrases, in exactly this pattern, they can't dock you for grammar because everything I've got on the screen here is grammatically correct. However, it is important not to forget that. Okay, so if you are talking about, changing something, and there may be some repercussions from that change, so you might want to point those out. However, it's important not to forget that. Although I don't know much about XYZ, I can't say that I know, I can't say that it is whatever, or I do know that it is whatever. As far as XYZ is concerned, I would imagine, so this is often a good way to return to a point perhaps that you had brought up earlier. So as far as Ottawa is concerned, I feel that the brain drain issue is really minor. It's not something that's going to have any significant effect on the overall ability of people in Ottawa to produce tech-related products. Okay, let's go to part 3. Now, part 3 is different from part 1 in that the examiner will be referring to unscripted questions. We'll be giving you unscripted questions. So it's much more of a discussion than part 1. And it will challenge you with questions that require you to give suggestions, to analyze a problem, to compare or contrast, to speculate. So for example, what do you think would happen if XYZ? So this is asking you to speculate on a problem or possible problem. You may have to explain something or defend something. So for example, in your monologue in part 2, you might have said something and then the examiner will respond, you said that you feel there should be fewer holidays in your country. Don't you think people require the occasional holiday to recuperate? They might ask you a question like this, and then you have to defend what you said earlier. Your response to each question is expected to be about 25 seconds long, again, on average. You should remember to be confident and engaged when you speak. So it's supposed to be a discussion. And in this section, your examiner will be more forgiving if you ask them to rephrase a question, because these are questions coming mainly from the examiner's mind. So even between native language speakers, asking for clarification on a question is normal. So asking for clarification once won't be a problem. Okay, let's look at some possible responses. So for example, if the examiner connects this to your part 2 response and says, when you were talking about your dream job, you mentioned you like science. How did your interest in science start? Okay, and then we would respond with something like, well, I suppose my fascination with whatever, if it's science, commenced when I was about 13. I had an inspirational teacher. And these words in here, because we all need to, some time to think sometimes, and these can be stretched a little bit, even, up to here. Well, I suppose my fascination with, see, I can stretch these out and it gives me a bit more time to think, and it makes it so that the examiner doesn't feel I'm being awkward, or that I'm pausing, or that I'm creating any sort of interruption in the flow of my speech. Okay, so don't be shy to pull these out a little bit if you need the time. How about here? Well, I guess it can be traced back to, now again, I'm drawing this out, or I could even change this to could, maybe sound a little bit better. I guess it could be traced back to an inspirational teacher I had 20 years ago. This person was very, see, when I draw my language out like that, you can't do it for the entire sentence, but just at the beginning, it helps to give you a bit of extra time to think and organize your thoughts. Honestly, I don't remember quite how I became fascinated with science. But I do remember several influential forces that likely played a part. The first was, I like the word several because it's a good way to set up a response that's going to have parts to it. And sometimes, you know, like we were talking before about things that we enjoy about our job, and we can specifically say there are two things I particularly like about my job. Sometimes we don't really know, or you know, we're not entirely sure how many points we're going to be sharing. So word like several helps to set up a logical response nicely. And then we can talk about the first. So the first person, and then you know what happens is then something else pops into your mind. Oh, and I can't forget Mr. Stevens. He was a neighbor I had that made an impression upon me as a child. So, you know, just elaborating a bit further on how we became interested in science, or whatever the question is. Okay. The examiner asks you 4 unscripted questions loosely related to the topic of part 2. So now we're getting 4 new questions, and these will also be related to the topics that have come before, but they're starting to branch out a little bit more. So, for example, how important do you think it is for people training to work in the sciences to understudy other scientists? Okay, so you know this might take us a second to pull our thoughts together, and these sorts of questions. I mean, like I was saying, you could ask for the examiner to rephrase or to state again, because they are a little bit longer and they're going to take a bit more brain power to respond to. So I feel that is a critical step to the training process, or I feel that is an imperative step to the training process, or I feel that is an unimportant step to the training process. That is a mundane step. That is an unneeded step to the training process. Okay, lots of different ways to qualify our answers. Scientists, or whatever, XYZ, need to experience the process of diagnosing patients firsthand. And then you could go on. So, for example, if they didn't have this as part of their training, they might not know what to do in the situation when it happens. Or we could respond something like, understudying is a major part of. I feel it is modestly important. Of greater importance is the theoretical training they get in class. Okay, so here we're turning the response around a little bit. How important is it? It's not important. What is more important is XYZ. I suppose that would depend on what science they're studying. And again, drag this out. Well, I suppose that would depend on what science they're studying. I mean, if they are planning to become medical practitioners, then yes, it is important. Then yes, it is important. But otherwise, right? And then we could continue on like that. So as you can see, there are certain phrases that you can use to be properly prepared for whatever situation comes up in your exam. So I hope you're able to include some of these short phrases in your own responses. Now, if you're listening to this and you don't have access to a speaking partner, I think A1 is you need to get yourself in touch with somebody on Skype, and you need to start practicing, coming up with your own. So with your partner, you can write your own sample IELTS questions, and just practice back and forth. And you should be practicing an hour at least every day. Practice your speaking, practice responding to these responses that are 5 seconds long, responses that are a minute long. You should be practicing all types, and try to pinpoint when you're going to be required to share facts, when you're going to be required to share opinions, and maybe support your opinions with facts. All of this is very important. So as I pointed out at the beginning of the video, you should come join us at IELTSnetwork.com. And you can find speaking partners there. You can post your speaking for me to listen to, for other students to listen to, and provide feedback. You can provide feedback to other students. I think it's a great tool that is available to you, so I hope that you will come and use it. Thank you very much for listening, and have a nice evening.